Good afternoon, Mr. Gambino. I have relished this opportunity to welcome you to the first and foremost podcast of Horizons & Co.
I am honoured to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, Justin, I've really enjoyed working with you in the arbitration department. You're definitely one of the standout members of the department. So I thought we'd just do this spontaneous podcast and just speak and have a conversation. I have to state at this stage that nothing has been prepared. Is that right, Justin?
Yes.
We have nothing in front of us.
No, I got notice of this literally 15 minutes ago.
So, and that's how I like it. So
Okay.
I hope you don't mind. It's too late anyway, even if you do.
To each his own.
So, arbitration, UAE,
Yes, sir.
Dubai. Explain. Fill in the gaps. Any difficulties that you found along the way that you have felt are specific to the region, specific to the city, specific to the jurisdiction? Have you enjoyed working here? What have the cases been like? What type of cases have you worked on? Just take the floor, Justin. Go for it.
Thank you. So I'd have to say that it's a very interesting time. When I came here in January 2020, I think it was the right time to come. Obviously, because there have been some legislative changes, and also Dubai has always been an emerging arbitration hub for quite some time now. So for me, it's been a great experience overall.
Fantastic. That's good to hear, Justin. Good
Okay.
to hear.
Okay, thank you. So as I was saying, the interesting thing for me was I left an established law firm, and I came here and I really threw myself in the deep end and tried to get my best to emerge myself in all our cases. So it's really been a fantastic experience. I've ever learned a lot from my colleagues, but also just practicing. And of course, with your mentoring, it's definitely been added advantage.
Fantastic. And how about local law? How have you incorporated local law into the arbitrations that you've worked on?
So obviously most of the arbitrations we have are governed by UAE law. Also, most of the arbitrations we have are seated here. So the application of the arbitration law is prevalent. Other than that, like I said, it's just been mostly learning, reading, and working with fine colleagues such as yourself.
Fantastic. And in working in a local law firm as opposed to an international law firm, which I believe obviously you worked in previously, any challenges, any kind of nuances you want to talk about?
I think I wouldn't call it a challenge, but for me, the biggest thing was definitely taking a more active role in these cases. So where I came from a place where each case was staffed by partner, senior associate, junior associates, paralegals. Here, the associates get the experience, get to run the show, obviously with the guidance and support of the partners when needed. So it's definitely given me the opportunity to develop my skills and see how much I know and how much I still have to learn.
Yeah, I think you're lucky in a way, Justin, because you came post the enactment of the arbitration law. I think if you came prior to that, you would have had a different experience.
Yes, I've heard some horror stories about the CPC, the relevant provisions of the procedure code.
Absolutely.
Before the enactment of the new law.
Absolutely. What I found fascinating about yourself, Justin, is when you came here, obviously coming from Milan, from Italy, I was concerned that you would find the culture of not just the law firm, but the place kind of overwhelming, perhaps, having not worked in the Middle East before. But what I was pleasantly and happy to see was that you took to it like a duck to water. You were more Arab than the Arabs, if I can say that. How did you find that type of thing?
That's very flattering, Areen. Thank you. So, like you know, when I told you when we first spoke before I joined, I had never been to Dubai before.
Yeah.
I'd been to the airport. That was pretty much it. So obviously it doesn't count. But it was a gamble, and it was a gamble that for me paid off both professionally and also culturally. I absolutely love the Middle East. I love Dubai, and I think that Italians and people from the Middle East are very similar. We have similar values, family, food, loyalty,
Very
and
good.
no, it's been overall, I really have no complaints. It's been an amazing year and a half for me, and I plan to stay here for many years to come.
Fantastic. And in relation to your legal progression in this region or in the Middle East as a whole, what do you think the future holds for the legal industry here? Do you think that, by way of example, the construction arbitrations that you are working on currently, do you think that will continue to be a thing here in terms of the lion's share of what you'll be working in, or do you think there are new avenues to pursue in relation to your disputes work?
Well, so in terms of disputes, obviously my experience and what I'm most familiar with is construction.
Yes.
I'm more than happy to consider other commercial matters, and I've done some stuff on other commercial matters, so I've been very fortunate in my experience in my career to do different things.
Yeah.
In terms of construction, the region, absolutely, it's the future here. One, because Dubai, I mean, you walk anywhere you go, you see cranes, you see construction sites, so it's definitely the future. Plus, Dubai has a tremendous number of projects in their future. I mean, Expo 2020 is now Expo 2021 for obvious reasons, but there are many other projects both in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, but also other countries throughout the region, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. So I think there'll be plenty of work for us in the construction industry for the next 10 to 15 years, if not longer.
What about litigation, Justin? Do you like litigation, or is your heart set on arbitration?
Well, I've never actually practiced litigation in the jurisdictions in which I'm licensed, but I do think litigation is an important part in arbitration because in many arbitrations you also have to look to the local courts for guidance and support, both before the arbitration starts, for example, by way of precautionary attachments on construction bonds, performance bonds, but also during the arbitral process. Now, one of the advantages of the arbitration law is now that international arbitrators can issue interim measures. However, not all parties are compliant, and therefore you do have to resort to the courts, which have much more pull, and there's also a threat of sanctions. So I think any good arbitration attorney needs to also be familiar with local law, local litigation law, but also have a good litigation team behind them to support them when needed.
I agree completely. I do think that the skill sets, obviously vis-a-vis litigation and arbitration, are transferable. I think a good litigator will make a good arbitrator. There are obviously differences, and the nuances are very important. But I do believe that a person that's a strong litigator, especially in this region, that has a wide array of experience in relation to specifically construction, because the jurisdiction that we are in is heavily influenced with construction, will make a good arbitrator or a good member of an arbitration team. What do you think needs to change in the arbitration sphere here, or in the litigation sphere, just generally in the disputes field?
So I really can't speak for litigation.
Okay.
But in terms of arbitration, I think, at least in this region, I think arbitration has become the preferred method of dispute resolution, especially between parties from different countries. I think what we need to do as a whole as an arbitration community is definitely educate members as to the correct practices.
Right.
So sometimes you see practitioners who simply just aren't familiar with procedure, and that can result in additional time, costs, and it frustrates the proceedings. And the other thing we have to be careful of is simply there are some practitioners who are well experienced in the field who sometimes result to unorthodox tactics to delay.
Sure.
Now, obviously, any good lawyer needs to always promote the best interest of the client, but at the same time, I think you have to do it in the right way. And it's a delicate balance that needs to be found.
So, previous to the 2018 federal law on arbitration, one of the major criticisms of arbitration was that it was so easy to scupper an award at enforcement. Do you think, and obviously you and I have worked on certain issues in the office, but just from your general view of the market, do you think that's changed? Do you think now arbitration as a process, and specifically the enforcement of awards, is more robust now?
Well, again, we need to keep in mind that the arbitration law only came out in 2018. But I think that the enactment of the law alone already sent an important signal to the community as a whole. And my understanding, talking to you, but also other colleagues in the litigation department, is now the courts have changed their approach drastically to how to enforce awards. It's much more streamlined, and I think that sends confidence also to people outside the jurisdiction, saying that Dubai is open for business, for arbitration, and I think we'll see a lot more work in the near future.
Yeah, it's definitely not as easy for a person or a party that's not happy with an award to use guerrilla tactics or to frustrate the process. Absolutely, I agree with you. Very, very good, Justin. Anything else that you'd like to share with us today?
Well, I'd like to ask you if you have any advice for people considering to move to the region to explore Dubai as an opportunity. What would you warn them?
Definitely. I think, as I told you all those years ago now, it feels like 10 years ago. I'm surprised you say January of 2020. But I told you, look, this is a fantastic jurisdiction. It's a dynamic jurisdiction. So my advice to people that aren't familiar with this jurisdiction or are coming from overseas is to embrace the dynamism of the place, is to embrace the cultural differences of everybody that you encounter here. Even in our office, Justin, as you're aware, we have so many people from different backgrounds and different jurisdictions. Obviously that has its advantages and we always speak about them, but it can be challenging at times. So I would tell that person that's coming from a foreign jurisdiction to be prepared, to be accepting of different ways of thinking, to be accepting of different approaches to law even, and the application and interpretation of law. I would also tell that person to, as you said very eloquently before, read and read, and do not think that, oh, I understand this issue, it's very similar to back home, and go with it. Things can be very different here. The laws, the civil laws specifically, the ones that you mentioned previously, the civil code, the civil transaction code, the commercial code, etc., need to be understood with the relevant commentary. We have to understand where these laws came from. I always tell everybody in this law firm and everybody I come into contact with, you have to have an understanding of Sharia also. Basic, even if it's the basic tenets of Sharia, to understand where our modern laws come from. After you have a basic understanding of the Islamic Sharia, then you understand where the modern Senhuri-based codes come from. I do believe it's important. Many a practitioner in this region skips that step when they first arrive here, and I think that's an integral step to being a better legal practitioner in the region.
I absolutely agree. And I'm definitely going to read up on the Sharia law.
Good man.
In the near future. Things
like, for example, an issue that you and I discussed recently on an award, the interest, the imposition of interest, when it starts, if it's applicable, if it's punitive, is it still enforceable, etc., etc. These issues, I would push one to read into further, and also, if you have a mentor, or if you have a senior in the law firm or in the community that you're in, speak to them. I do think that us as lawyers have to speak to each other more, and this is actually why I think this initiative of a podcast is a good one, because I think conversations with colleagues in the office, but more importantly, colleagues outside of what we are familiar with, is important.
I agree, I think you raise an interesting point, specifically with regards to Sharia law, because coming from a common law jurisdiction, we're used to whatever the contract says is what governs, absent extraordinary circumstances. But in this case, I think local law and there are mandatory principles in the civil code that people are just not familiar with, especially coming from a common law jurisdiction. For example, the principles of good faith. That's something that you cannot write off, and is something that you always need to keep in the back of your mind when writing a contract, or then when you are arbitrating or litigating with regards to the terms of the contract.
I think you're spot on there. I mean, people come here and they read the odd article and they think, okay, there's no binding precedent, I get that, there's no this, there's no that, but the real underlying principles they kind of skip or just gloss over. I urge people, and I think perhaps this is because I've always been in local law firms, and my passion is really in local law and local dispute resolution. I really would urge all practitioners, even our corporate colleagues. I have many a colleague in the corporate departments of international law firms, of regional law firms, that don't really delve into the principles of law and the foundations of our legal system here in the UAE. I would urge everybody listening and everybody that's around me, and my team knows very well when we have our training sessions, how much I hit home the origins, the principles, the founding principles of the UAE legal system. I think are very, very important to know, and to know very well.
I think that's actually a great topic for an article we could write
at
some point.
Yeah, Ashley?
Yeah. Please take notes.
Okay, thank you, Justin. I think that's enough for the first podcast. Okay. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to the next one.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.